That's all right.
Yeah.
I'm trying to sleep. My dad is ready to sleep.
Oh, I thought you said because I'm going to the bathroom. Because I usually have to go a lot.
Flat right here.
Thank you, Flo.
Carrie.
Is it on? Yes.
My son Will.
Let me go first.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you so much for coming and celebrating this wonderful occasion of Race Amity Day here at Beyond Edgewood together. I'll introduce myself. My name is Marjan Yovari. I am the owner and operating manager of this complex Beyond Edgewood. And
Someone's got it.
I will share with you the story of how this building came about and its relevance to Race Amity and why we're here today. Our family moved to the city of Atlanta, and we're members of the Baha'i community, and I'm also Iranian American and a member of the Baha'i community. So we moved to the city limits of Atlanta, and our Baha'i Center is 2 doors down on 379 Edgewood Avenue. And our one of the friends told us, "Do you know the story of the Baha'i Center?" I thought, "No. What's the story of the center?" And they shared with us that in the 1930s, the Baha'i community refused to be segregated during the Jim Crow era. And because of their endeavors and meeting interracially, there was a lot of backlash towards the Baha'i community. And one time they asked them, they said, unless you have a center or a church of your own, you no longer are allowed to meet interracially. So the Baha'i community tried to rent different places in the 40s, and they were unable to do so because as soon as they would show up interracially, they would stop them from having their meetings. So in 1945, or 46, a gentleman by the name Leroy Burns, he was a U.S. Postal Service who was close to retirement and was living in this district, had purchased that plot of land to build a home for his retirement for him and his wife. And they decided to donate that and build that center brick by brick in order to establish the first building in Atlanta for interracial gatherings. So that was and really their story moved us. And the essence of the Baha'i faith is oneness of God, oneness of religion, and oneness of humanity. And our family, my dear husband is back there, Navid and I had a conversation, and all of these buildings were abandoned. And we contacted dear friend Chris, who's back there, I appreciate Vantage Group, and they helped us purchase these abandoned properties. And once we purchased them, we thought, how can we continue the essence of race amity, race unity, and understanding and communication and work together to improve our community, our society, and empowering our community. And so we began the construction, and a year and a half ago, we inaugurated Beyond Edgewood. And this building is dedicated to the efforts of Race Amity, which we collaborated with to come from Boston to have the brick and mortar center here, and start the work that we all need to do, which is get to know one another, get to know our community from all backgrounds, and really have more friendships and bonds and relationships built. So thank you for coming today. We appreciate your support, and I will pass the mic to my dear sister Nwanti.
It means a lot. I don't know how many of you were automatically familiar with the term race amity. Many of you probably are. I was not until a few years ago. And so one of the ways that Marjan and I are friends and associates is we both serve on the board for the National Center for Race Amity. I was recently appointed, and she has, of course, been a long time servant of that. But when I first heard this term, and because, with so much of language, it's kind of like, well, what does this mean? I speak French, so I knew that amity was amité. And so I had an idea that it was something to do with friendship. But I'll just tell you a few things that I've learned since I became familiar with this very, very significant movement of people who truly believe and truly work toward the idea that all people must work together as one people. And some of these divisions that we have are completely artificial. So even the children who are in the next room during their lesson, they're learning a little bit right now about the fact that in 1912, Abdu'l-Baha, a man who is very significant within the Baha'i faith, but also within just the history of humanity, he came to the United States, and among the ideas that he was promoting in 1912, so just take yourself back a little bit in time, was the idea that all of the people of the world deserved to be treated equally, to have access to the same justice, to have access to education, to be able to fulfill their full potential. 1912. Less than 50 years after the abolition of chattel slavery in the United States. And so you can imagine that these ideas did not immediately resonate with everyone. Not everyone was able to respond to them. But the term amity becomes very significant because often when we think about how to overcome an obstacle, we think about the ways in which we can combat that. How do you fight something that is in opposition? Abdu'l-Baha came with a much different spirit. He realized, of course, that the people did not yet know how to live as one people. That would be very impossible. They had only less than several generations ago been treating one another as property and doing all manner of things to one another that are quite inhumane. However, he used this tool of friendship to bring the people into closer communion with one another. And there are so many examples of how he did this. But one in particular I just wanted to point out is that there was a distinguished attorney by the name of Louis Gregory. He had been the son of formerly enslaved people, but went on to Fisk and University and then on to Howard University, became an attorney, worked for the government, and frankly for a man of his time, an African-American man of his time, was doing remarkably well materially. And then he encountered the teachings of the Baha'i faith, and in particular Abdu'l-Baha himself. And on one occasion when Abdu'l-Baha was visiting Washington, D.C., 1912, I want to point out once again, he noticed that even though he had been meeting with Abdu'l-Baha earlier, when it was time for the people to actually sit down and have a meal, there was no thought that Abdu'l-Baha would be bringing Louis Gregory with him. So the people had made a space, Abdu'l-Baha was going to sit and eat, but he asked a simple question: where is Mr. Gregory? Please bring Mr. Gregory. And so without any sense of contention or conflict, he was able to shift the social order. While the people were going to get Louis Gregory, who was being sent out the back door, as would have been customary at the time, while they were bringing him back into the room, Abdu'l-Baha very carefully just cleared a place at his right side, the position of honor for Mr. Gregory, and seated him. And so in that simple act, he was able to make very clear that Mr. Gregory was not less than the people in the room, even though the United States was emerging from its period of enslavement and needed to, of course, learn new ways of being, new ways of thinking, new ways of acting. So this is 1912. Abdu'l-Baha continues after he leaves the United States to encourage that the friends will learn to come together the way that we have today in racial amity. The idea that we can be together in the same space, we can work together across all sorts of lines, including lines of race, or the imaginary precept, perhaps, that we have of race. And so he continued to work with the friends here, and you may be aware that historically, a few years after he left, pretty soon after he left, World War I emerged, and at the conclusion of World War I, we had a very strong feeling of racial tension in the United States, leading in 1919 to what some know as the Red Summer. It's a series of massacres, quite honestly. Often people, when I was growing up, would refer to them as riots, but I don't think that the historical record says that. They were actually massacres. And many of us are the descendants of people who escaped from those particular massacres. The Lawsons escaped from one in Arkansas. So here we are now in 1990, and instead of Abdu'l-Baha telling the people that they should in some way retreat from this, he begins encouraging very strongly that they need to organize an official conference that brings together the races. And so he does this with some unlikely people, one in particular, Mrs. Agnes Parsons. Mrs. Agnes Parsons was a wealthy white woman. And by your standards today, my friends, she would not be considered a particularly progressive wealthy white woman. In fact, she was often very cautious about African Americans. And she and her husband actually believed that formerly enslaved people would be better off if they were recolonized to Africa. So these were ideas that people were exchanging at the time. But rather than declaring that these people were abominable and they needed to be cast out, let's call them out, instead Abdul-Wahad drew them in. And I won't go into too much detail, but Agnes Parsons and Mr. Lewis Gregory, the one who I said had been seated to his right side, were very instrumental in organizing what became the first Race Amity Conference. And that was on May 21st, 1921 in Washington, D.C. Can you imagine? Once again, just please think of these years that I am noting here. 1921, you have all of the races coming together in this space at a time where this would have been unheard of. And this is their mission statement at that time, now 100 years back. It says, the great work that we have to do, and for which this conference is called, is the establishment of amity between the white and colored people of our land. When we have put our own house in order, then we may be trusted to carry out the message of universal peace to all mankind. And so we're here today as a continuation of that history. And it has continued generation after generation, gathering momentum. It's not by accident that we are here in this historic Auburn Avenue area, the birthplace of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., who then took this idea further in the civil rights movement and the creation of beloved community. The idea that we can live and work and associate with each other and collaborate with each other in all aspects of our lives. So you now are part of that legacy. You've decided to come today and to commemorate this Race Amity Day with us. And so that's part of how it will go further. Of course, we recognize that today we have not fully achieved our goal. But your mere presence in this room means that the hope that Abdul-Wahad inspired in 1912 has not in any way been extinguished. So we look forward to our time together today, a chance to commemorate, and I hope that your time will permit you to stay through the entire program, including the time where we'll get to do a bit of fellowshipping and have some refreshments together. Sometimes we think of that as kind of a frivolous portion of the program, but when it comes to Race Amity, that actually is where the rubber meets the road. So if you're able to, please do stay the entire time, get a chance to know some of the friends that you haven't met yet. They could be some really close associates and collaborators if we allow ourselves to do that. And so now just to continue and to set the tone for what we are doing today, we have a brief film that explains a little bit more about the history of this whole ceremony.
At the end of May 1921, the nation's capital played host to a multiracial, interfaith gathering, the likes of which had rarely been seen in the segregated South. For 3 days, thousands of people assembled at the First Congregational Church of Washington, D.C., in the first ever convention for amity between the colored and white races. One of the key contributors to this history-making visionary event was an African-American son of slaves who was a man of deep faith, a scholar, a lawyer, an ardent believer in race unity. His name was Lewis G. Gregory. The narrative that frames this documentary is taken from his diary reports of events at the 1921 National Convention of Amity Between the Races.
The North and the South, Orient and Occident, colored and white, mingled in a picturesque setting of 5 sessions over a period of 3 days. The First Congregational Church, which in past years had welcomed so many liberal and progressive groups, opened its doors for all sessions. Among the distinguished people who aided the endeavor were Reverend Dr. Jason Noble Pierce, Honorable Moses E. Clapp, former senator from Nebraska, Senator Samuel Shortridge of California, Z. Lee Cook, famous Southern businessman, Dr. Elaine Locke, Honorable Martin B. Madden, Congressman from Illinois, William H. Randall, Professor George W. Cook, Mrs. Coralie Franklin Cook, Roy C. Wilhelm, Janabi Fado Nezandariani of Iran, and Lieutenant General Nelson A. Miles, commanding the American Army.
I attended every session, day and night. Many times throughout the meetings did with much effort restrain my tears. My heart leapt and throbbed and many times almost burst within my breast. I am a colored man. My race as a whole, I believe, is quite ready to welcome the glad day when all will be brothers. The trouble is merely unilateral. God, give us the day.
It was a time not unlike today. 50 years had elapsed since the Civil War and the emancipation of America's enslaved people. At the federal level, Reconstruction amendments passed in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War recognized the humanity of African Americans, but Jim Crow laws in the South encroached on nearly every aspect of life. America's apartheid, Jim Crow first impinged on voting rights one after the war. Then, step by step, inch by inch, Jim Crow outlawed even the most superficial of cross-racial mingling. Schools, hospitals, amusement parks, train platforms, bus depots, doctors' waiting rooms, restrooms, post office and bank teller windows. At the same time, the Ku Klux Klan arose again to enforce the Jim Crow social order.
Terrible, horrendous things happening to blacks, lynching and burning people. And not only that, we also have to remember that these lynchings and burning of people, it would invite men, women, and children and see these things. You see, and so you had a culture. It was a celebration of the denigration of black women.
Then in 1919, the nation's capital and more than 30 other American cities erupted into violence and chaos, incited by white mobs in unprovoked attacks on blacks.
What we see in 1919 in various places, throughout the country, well, certainly in Chicago and DC, is that blacks are showing the defiance and they're showing the willingness to fight back rather than to just be victimized.
This first Race Amity Convention, then, provided stark contrast to the prevailing patterns of the era. Thousands of men and women from various racial backgrounds, hues, cultural traditions, and social classes chose to sit shoulder to shoulder in church pews for 3 straight days, a simple but truly revolutionary act.
The specific purpose of this initial convention was race understanding. Eloquent addresses, large audiences responding not only to the wide press notices, but the circulation of 19,000 programs, ideal weather, and an atmosphere that was spiritual and heavenly, could have but an extraordinary effect. And the spirit of reconciliation seemed to sweep the city. This convention had the fervent approval of the President of the United States, although officially he took no part in it. The gratitude of the Chief Executive may be well understood when it is recalled that but a short time before, the historic city had been violently disturbed by a race riot fatal to many. Now the cleansing and purifying power of the Holy Spirit was at work, bringing harmony and peace to those who had passed through the shadow of death.
Whether aware of it or not, when convention goers stepped through the doors of the church, they also stepped into the flow of the other tradition.
there have been people all over the country, all through history, who have been able to envision a different kind of society.
We know about the tradition of racism, and it's important that we study the tradition of racism. But at the same time, we need to understand that there's a parallel tradition. They're interrelated.
The other tradition is something where people from different racial ethnic groups have worked together to address social injustices throughout history.
The other tradition dates back to the origins of European settlement in North America. In 1619, early colonists captured African men and brought them in bondage to Jamestown, Virginia. While enslavement grew in reach, the other tradition freshened the historically rich soil of the colonial period. As interracial communities appeared along Virginia's eastern shore, from about 1650 to 1670, blacks and whites in these communities exchanged land and livestock, hired and fired each other, rented rooms in each other's homes, and cross-racial marriage and adoption became commonplace. As history unfolded, this ever-present other tradition of cross-racial collaboration was practiced. Blacks and whites formed bands of brotherhood while fighting alongside one another in the Revolutionary War, created an underground railroad for the protection and safe passage of the enslaved who sought freedom, joined ranks again to save the Union during the Civil War, and sat in legislative halls together during Reconstruction to actively envision an interracial democracy. Sometimes quiet, sometimes loud, often hidden or overlooked, this other tradition has always been present, characterized by close collaboration, amity, and mutual respect. The other tradition responded to the tumult leading up to 1921. Interracial co-workers established the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and the National Urban League at the national level. Inspiring a network of chapters across the nation, they provided a forum for blacks and whites to advance access, equity, and social justice. And in 1921, the movement of Race Amity conventions began with religious inspiration. Race Amity conventions were envisioned by a spiritual leader living in the Middle East. Abdul-Baha was the son of the founder of the Baha'i faith, a religion whose central principle is the oneness of mankind. He traveled to the United States in 1912 and studied the situation of race relations from afar for many years.
Abdul-Baha envisioned a new sociology for the world in general and America in particular. He invites the attention of social workers to the oases rather than the deserts of their environments and helps them to extend the boundaries. In this nation's internal development, there is no more lurid and tragic chapter than that of race relations. It is to this, therefore, that Abdul-Baha directed his great thought, turning his searchlight upon the national disease and prescribing with marvelous wisdom the remedy.
Abdul-Baha constantly talked about the importance of racial unity. He described the whites as parallels and the blacks as satellites. He created a lexicon of racial or interracial appreciation.
When it came to the first Race Amity Convention, Abdul-Baha placed responsibility squarely on the shoulders of a woman by the name of Mrs. Agnes S. Parsons.
Agnes Parsons, this Washington, D.C. socialite, who had very little exposure to African Americans. She wasn't necessarily what you would call the most progressive person. She wasn't a Jane Addams. She wasn't a radical white woman. So why did he pick her?
The call for blacks and whites to come together for a new effort to abolish prejudice needed to come from a well-to-do white person, not from African Americans who could easily be sidelined and disregarded.
With famed philosopher, educator, and Rhodes Scholar Alain Locke serving as chair of one of the sessions, the program included talks on the spiritual and scientific components of interracial brotherhood. Artistic presentations celebrated Black culture through a musical performance by violinist Joseph Douglas, grandson of Frederick Douglass. A talk on Black poets by Coralie Cook, a professor at Howard University, and an evening of traditional African American spirituals with historical commentary given by Howard University Director of Music, Gabrielle Pelham, and the University Dean of Music, Lou LeVere. In modern minds, performances of Black music and poetry are commonplace, and perhaps even the stereotypical role assigned to Black presenters. But from the time of emancipation onward, Jim Crow had been aided by a propaganda campaign against Black people. Scholar W.E.B. Du Bois called it one of the most stupendous efforts the world ever saw to discredit human beings. This campaign involved universities, history, science, social life, and religion, and placed into the minds of Americans from kindergarten to adulthood that people of African descent had never contributed to civilization. The convention's focus on celebrating Black civilization served as both education and healing. Shortly thereafter, Alain Locke launched the revolutionary framework for African American scholarship and artistic expression in initiating the Harlem Renaissance, the fountainhead of African American scholarship, to advance American intellectual and artistic expression. This first Race Amity Convention sparked a national movement of large-scale interracial gatherings. Washington, D.C. hosted 3 more conventions in 1922, 1923, and then formed a racial amity discussion group led by Coralie Cook and Agnes Parsons. Springfield, Massachusetts also held a convention in the winter of 1921. In 1924, New York City saw a collaborative effort between the national leadership of the NAACP, National Urban League, and the Baha'i community. At that city's convention, Alain Locke shared the stage with W.E.B. Du Bois, Jane Addams, and James Weldon Johnson. Throughout the 1920s, conventions took place in Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, Montreal, Detroit, and Pittsburgh. Even small communities in the Rocky Mountains were inspired to hold interracial dinners and discussions. These race amity gatherings and conferences were held off and on in various cities into the 21st century. In 2011, on the 90th anniversary of the 1921 conference, the National Center for Race Amity committed to revive and hold a National Race Amity Conference. This commitment led to the May 21st, 2021 convening of the centenary celebration of that first conference 100 years earlier. No student of history could say race amity conventions solved America's struggle with racism. However, despite the tumult then and now, we must mark with joy and take inspiration of this 100th anniversary of the first Race Amity Convention. It celebrates a moment in time when in the midst of crisis, chaos, and violence, there is a present and growing moral consensus which has as its center amity and association. This moves us towards e pluribus unum as we become the better in us. This is our nation's vision and our destiny.
So you have to imagine that I saw this documentary and Dr. William Smith, known as Smitty, was here in Atlanta debuting this documentary. And I wasn't in town, but I heard from the Baha'i community that Dr. Smitty was here. And so we had just purchased these properties, and I kept thinking, we really need a place to continue the efforts of the civil rights and the King Center, and also the history of the Baha'i community, and we need to bring it to the forefront of this neighborhood. And so when I heard about Race Amity, I thought, gosh, I would love to have them. And they were in Boston at the time. So I contacted Dr. Smith and I said, Smitty, you don't know me. My name is Marjan. I'm in Atlanta. And I would love to talk to you about a possibility of having a brick and mortar center for Race Amity, because the work you're doing is incredible. The history is incredible. And Smitty said, when can I be there? I said, how about this weekend? So we flew to Atlanta. And I have to tell you, we were both standing at that rooftop next door. And we're in Edgewood, and usually there's, pigeons and crows and other birds, wildlife. But as we're standing on the rooftop, and it always brings me to tears because Smitty passed away a month before we opened the center. But we're saying, should we do this, should we not? This was an abandoned building, the roof had collapsed, there was a lot of work to be done. And we kept thinking, do we have the manpower to do this? And as we're talking, a white dove sat between us. And I'm a Persian woman, and he's a black man. And we looked at each other and said, this is divine confirmation. The white dove literally on Edgewood Avenue sat between us. And we both, just tears in our eyes, cried and held hands and said a prayer and said, we will get this done no matter what. And so, really, from the bottom of our heart, welcome to all of you.
Here already, and I'm sure you yourselves in watching this, especially if it's the first time you see this documentary, just thinking about this movement, one of the greatest forces in the United States that hardly anyone knows is happening. It's almost like it's under the surface, and it's been growing all of these over 100 years, and it's going to continue to flourish and grow as well. Yes, so we have a wonderful opportunity this afternoon. We have a keynote speaker who, for many of us, doesn't require much introduction, but I'll just say that Dr. Robert Henderson has been a leader in so many different fields, from business development, certainly high-level leadership within the Baha'i community itself, has assisted so many corporations and organizations to understand better how their affairs can be managed in a way that bring more and more people together. And in all of the things that he has contributed to, we see that whether it is scholarship or business leadership or leadership within a community of faith, he always brings to it the idea that spiritual maturity really requires that we recognize that we are in fact one. But he never does that with a kind of a Disney appeal. He realizes you have to roll up your sleeves and work hard, because there's going to be lots of bumps in the road, and if every time we hit one of those bumps we run away, we'll never get to our destination. So it's really with great honor that I would like to invite you to welcome Dr. Robert C. Henderson, who's going to present the roots of America 25 of Race Amity perspective.
So, hello everybody. Hello. You know, I was listening to Marjan tell the story about the acquisition and development of this building. And I was remembering Marjan the first time that I came over. And at that point, none of this was here. As a matter of fact, we opened the door and the first thing that Marjan did was to yell inside, to say, we're coming in. Because she didn't assume that she was alone. And everything was mess. And so to take this building that has such a distinguished place in the community and to develop this wonderful space for us to gather and to celebrate our oneness and our unity is truly a magnificent achievement. And I see Naveed back there with Marjan, and I just want to thank them both for the incredible commitment they have. To society building and to demonstrating a level of commitment and personal involvement in creating spaces for all of us to gather. Now, I am somewhat disheveled because for the first time in I don't know how many years, I had a flat tire on the way here. And you know, now all of our cars are electronic these days. So now you get messages. It used to be the car just went flat and that was that. You had to get out and look. But now the car sends you warnings. It says, first of all, you're losing air. And then it sent me another message that said, you're really losing it fast. And it was bad. And so the first message said, you're down 5 pounds in the left rear tire. And then it said, you're down 30 pounds. The 5 pounds I didn't worry about, but the 30 pounds got my attention. So the deal was find Pep Boys or something and get Uber. So my car is someplace, I think I remember. And tomorrow, hopefully it'll still be there with a new tire. And Uber was quick, and I'm happy to be here, albeit somewhat disheveled. I do want to say a few things about the importance of this moment in American history, because we stand on the eve of the 250-year anniversary of the founding of the United States. But we're also at a crossroads in the development of our nation. And we are in the process of deciding as a people who we will be. Now, I think it is extremely fortunate that we are gathered here in the shadow of the Ebenezer Baptist Church, where so many heroes, many whose names we know, many more whose names we don't know, made incredible progress in the quest to make real the promises of democracy. And they demonstrated that the transformation of a nation as a whole depends on the initiative and the commitment of the individuals who compose that nation. They showed us that if you're going to build the kingdom of God's heaven on earth, you've got to build it in your heart first. Now, we all know the great names that were the standard bearers of that movement. But I want to call to our attention the thousands and thousands of people who, after a hard day's work in the fields or wherever they labor, sat by candlelight in their cabins and learned how to read so they could register to vote, who learned how to read so that they could fill out a job application, who learned how to read so that they could begin to move the mechanisms of democracy in the favor of the disenfranchised. Those are the folks who transformed the spirit and character of our nation, and we learned great lessons during that period and from then to now. One of the things we learned was that we have to persevere, because this is not a race that will be won in the short term. This is a long-term journey that will require stamina, spiritual stamina, and great focus of mind. We have learned that the progress that we've achieved can be eroded by backstabbing, that the hard-won gains can be reversed by courts and by public attitude. And we've learned that if we're going to transform this nation, we have to arise to a new standard of commitment. But we have also learned that a country, a nation, whose ancestry includes every people on earth, whose motto is E pluribus unum, whose ideals of freedom under law have inspired millions and millions of people in countries all over the world, cannot discriminate or have prejudice against any racial or ethnic group without betraying itself. That the nation as a whole suffers. Martin Luther King taught us that lesson. He said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. That we are all tied together in a single garment of destiny. What affects me directly affects all of us indirectly. Heather McGhee, a black economist of great renown, taught us some of the impact of that betrayal. She told us the story of a 12-year-old white boy in a small town in Alabama who was standing in a public park weeping and sobbing. And he was weeping and sobbing because cranes were filling up the public pool with concrete. Now, it had been the plan of this nation to build public parks all over the South. And in fact, they did. And these parks had petting zoos, and they had picnic grounds, and they had swimming pools, and they had volleyball and basketball courts, and they had all kinds of recreational areas for people in the community to gather. But when black people were not allowed to go into those parks and to swim in those pools and to play basketball on those courts, the NAACP and others brought suit. And rather than integrate the public parks, they filled them with concrete and bulldozed them over. And all over the South, these lovely areas that had walking gardens and beautiful areas for people to gather, all of them were destroyed rather than make them available to the people who lived in that community. And what it teaches us about our quest to build a new kind of American society is that our starting point was to desegregate the law. That was the initial objective of civil rights. But if we desegregate the law and fail to integrate the kitchen table and the living room sofa, we will not achieve the goal of changing the spirit and character of this nation and inspiring it with a spirit of oneness. The movie you just saw, the primary point of it was that all of God's children are one and precious in His sight. And that all of us must collaborate in order to build the kind of society that the Bible referred to as the kingdom of heaven on earth. That's what we're trying to do. And what the movie also taught us was that that is going to be a difficult and long-term process. And the reason it is that we're not just interested in structural change. We're interested in the spiritual transformation of the human heart, so that people begin to see each other differently and come together differently. Now, Heather McGhee's point is that prejudice betrays the better interests of the nation as a whole. And the young white boy who was sobbing over the destruction of his public pool was just one example. not 2 months after she published her landmark book, The Sum of Us, which documented the price the nation pays to discriminate. Citibank, one of the largest financial organizations on the planet, published a report called The Racial Wealth Gap. And what it said was that the American economy paid from the year 2000 until the year 2020, paid $1 trillion a year for the right to discriminate. That it was costing the American economy $1 trillion a year in all kinds of lost opportunities and extraordinary expenses. $1 trillion a year. Now, we just passed an infrastructure bill, and it was only $1 trillion. It was 1.3. We're giving away $1 trillion a year for the right to keep some people from their birthright as souls. They went on to say that from 2020 on, that cost to the American economy would go from $1 trillion a year to $2.5 trillion per year. And let's just remember what that means. That means that universal health care is outside our reach because we're giving the money away for the right day. It means that universal child care is outside our reach, easily paid for by the money we're giving away. It means that the 14 million children that go to bed hungry every night because of food insecurity will continue to be hungry in the richest and most powerful nation the world has ever seen because of the right to discriminate. And here's what else it means. It means, as the report said, that by 2035, the average net wealth of an African American in the United States will be zero. Zero. And they forecast that the social, political, and economic impact of that will be devastating to the nation as a whole. You can imagine the instability that that creates when you have so many people just fighting to survive. But friends, the negative side of the story is not the only side of the story. Because as the history the film tells, helps us understand, this has been a slow development process that can accelerate with bursts of our own commitment. As I said before, the transformation of the nation as a whole depends on the commitment and the initiative and the change of character of the individuals that compose that nation. And I just want to give you a couple of examples of the kind of change that is within our grasp. I went to a school called the Bahia Vista School in California. It's in one of the richest neighborhoods in all of the United States. And that neighborhood borders the migrant labor camps in Central California. By law, the public schools were ordered to integrate those camps. And what that meant was that some of the richest kids in America were now going to school with migrant labor kids who spoke 27 different languages. It was chaos in the schools until one of the teachers decided, let's turn this school into an English as a second language school so that all people can develop the capacity to talk with everybody else. Well, I was there as a member of the Board of Visitors for the Buck Trust, which had funded the effort to turn this school into an English as a second language school. And they had been at it for about 5 years. And here's what I saw. I saw that in kindergarten, all of the kids communicated by mime. They would just pantomime and just kind of indicate what they needed. The second thing that I learned was that the first additional language a child would learn wouldn't necessarily be English. It would be the language of their best friend. The third thing I learned was that by the fifth grade, every child in that school spoke at least 3 languages fluently. And by the 6th grade, they spoke 4. The next thing I learned was that every one of those kids, that the school itself was testing at the top 99% level in reading, math, writing, and science in the California State Achievement Tests. And here's the last thing I learned. Those parents, rich parents, who had protested so vigorously about the integration of their school, a school that their property taxes paid lavishly for, and who had said, those kids aren't American, those kids don't belong here, and those kids are a danger to my kids. When you went into the classroom, there was such a mix of the teacher, the rich parents, and the poor parents that you couldn't tell who was who. Because they were all collaborating for the development of the kids. And this is what else I learned. They had adopted a philosophy that every student is a leader. And on their website, their little website, you had this skinny little kid with those spaghetti arms that are characteristic of a 9-year-old, with a red cape on, as if he was about to launch into the air as Superman. And you had happiness. Their strategy for mitigating conflict was that they were teaching all of the kids from 1st grade peer mediation skills. So that if there was a conflict between the kids who were skilled in peer mediation would help facilitate resolution of that conflict. That's what I saw. And so here we are, building a wall to keep everybody out, as if walls have been historically effective in the past. I know you all know that joke about somebody who was on the other side of the wall, saw the wall, and said, oh, look, a wall. It's just, you know, we're going to go over it, around it. The better thing would be to facilitate cooperative relations with the nations that are in distress from which the refugees are fleeing. Because they have natural resources, which, if developed, could make them prosperous and able nations, where people would want to reside and where we might want to go. Just like the most frequently observed person, expatriate in Costa Rica, is an American retiree. Why? Because Costa Rica is prosperous and beautiful. There's no reason why other nations can't be the same. If we look right here in Atlanta, in 1967, you all will remember Calvin Craig. Calvin Craig was a 6'4", blonde-haired, blue-eyed Grand Imperial Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. And he handed in his Klan robes after a conversation that had lasted about 2 years with 4'10" civil rights icon Zernona Clay. And Zernona had convinced him over a long period of time in which he was forced into Job Corps because the factory he worked in closed, and she was the director of Job Corps. And so you can imagine, here's Zernona Clay, and if you've ever seen Zernona, she's tiny. I'm saying 4'10", but maybe not. And she began a conversation with a man who hated the fact of her existence. 2 years later, that man handed in folded robes on CBS News, renouncing the Klan, renouncing hatred, and saying that we cannot be a great nation if we raise our children to hate. So you don't think that individuals can exert an influence. You're not thinking clearly. I was in Florence, South Carolina. I was in a house that was probably a little bit smaller than just the square area. The entire house was smaller than that area. The house was owned by an 81-year-old white woman from Indiana who had moved to a black neighborhood to help junior youth develop. And so I'm in the house, and the kids run the show, and it's clear. Now, Miss Ellis was sitting on the side of her sofa, and all the little kids are organized, and they have prayers to say, and they have plans to make, because they have decided that they have agency in their neighborhood, and that their job is community building. And so what do these kids do? Well, they weed the garden of people they know are ill. They cleaned up the house of one of the women who had passed away, because she always kept a clean house, and we should do her that honor. They had plans to change their school. They were looking at kids who were in trouble. They were smoking, or they were drinking, or they were fiddling with drugs, and their strategy was that they are doing those things because they don't have friends, so systematically we're going to be their friends. And we're going to bring them into the circle of our activities instead of allowing them to wander off and be mistreated by the world and as a result of bad decisions they make. And all of the time, Miss Ellis, 81 years old, white from Indiana, doesn't know anything about the South, doesn't know anything about black kids necessarily, had created this loving environment in their house. And these kids had a sense of agency. So let me tell you what that means. I asked the kids, tell me about yourself. Who are you? What you doing? This one little kid, Eric, he was skinny enough to worry about. You just wanted to feed him. And he was twitchy. And I said, Eric, tell me your story. He said, well, I decided I was going to be a lawyer. Because lawyers are the boss of everybody, and nobody bosses them around. Now, what he's really saying is, I want to protect myself. And I want a badge and a shield that is strong enough for me to be defended against the forces that would govern my life otherwise. He said, but since I've been in this group, I decided I'm not going to be a lawyer. I said, well, what are you going to be? He said, I'm going to be a second grade math teacher. I said, well, why is that? He said, because if I can convince 7-year-old black kids that they're smart, it'll change their lives. And all the time, Mary Alice is sitting at the corner of her sofa, and she hasn't said a word. She's just giving agency to those kids. You see, what I'm saying is that the transformation of a nation really does depend on the changing character and the initiative of the individuals that compose it. And that in every case, one individual can initiate a process of change that not only changes individual lives, but gives life to so many others. You told the story of dear Smitty, and many years ago, Smitty and I and a couple of others started a street academy for high school dropouts in Springfield, Massachusetts. We all went to the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. I was 19 years old, and I was one of the teachers in the school, which meant that I had to organize my classes at the university so they didn't conflict with my teaching, and it also meant that I had to read ahead of what I was teaching the kids. But here's what I'm here to tell you. 76 kids we graduated in 4 years. 74 of them, all of whom had been expelled by virtually every high school in Springfield, got college degrees. One of those kids, who had been expelled from all 5 high schools, became a doctor at Grady Hospital. His brother, whose name was Fluke, was his lawyer. My point is, you know, we didn't have any money, we didn't have any agency, we didn't have anything. But we were just trying to make a little difference. And 74 kids later, we were able to say that these kids went to college because of a little something we helped them do. So let me conclude by saying this. Any assessment of the current condition of the United States would cause us to conclude that we are in a moment of fracture as a society. It would cause us to conclude that the only force in our future is polarization and the intensification of social conflict. It would cause us to conclude that it might be better for us just to step away out of the glare of the spotlight. When we learn, for example, about the University of Chicago and Brookings Institute studies, 4 studies, of who the January 6th rioters were and why they did it. It turns out they were rich, they were educated, and they were from blue states. And 93% of the thousands of people they interviewed said that they had one primary motivation: 2043. 2043 is the year that the majority of American citizens will turn from white to brown. That was their primary concern. So when we think about the work that we have to do, let's begin to think of the steps that we can take with our neighbors, in our own hearts, in the conversations that we can initiate. Let us begin to remember that the Bible teaches us that in the time of the end, God will give us one heart and inspire us with a spirit of unity and make us one family. And let us begin to remember that each and every one of us has a role and a responsibility to keep that covenant. There's a beautiful passage in the Baha'i writings, and it says that our job as individual souls has to be to make every enemy an intimate friend, to put an end to alienation, and to offer a hand of brotherhood or sisterhood to everyone. Offer a helping hand to your fallen oppressor. Rid yourself of the idea that social elevation gives you agency and status. They call this world a rubbish heap and tell us that our job is to bring happiness to the inmates of heaven. And they say to us that the way we can do this is to be an uplifter of every victim of oppression, to be a treasury to the poor and a cure for the alien, to meet resistance and hostility with sincere kindness and steadfastness, and to know that if we keep that covenant, we will ultimately banish the darkness forever and ever. And if we do these things, starting in our own little invisible ways, we can have a transformational impact on the direction of this society and make real the promise of e-pluralism, that out of the vast diversity of the American population, we become one people. This, we believe, is the destiny of America. And we are so happy that you joined us today to consider some of these ideas and to think about the ways that you might advance conversations. Think about the ways that you might engage in services that help fulfill this vision. Thank you so much.
sure that these profound thoughts are resonating with us so much in our heads and in our hearts. And it reminds me so much of a very seminal point, which is that racism, of course, is a profound deviation from the standard of true morality. I think human beings feel this in our soul, even if we don't know how to get out of it. And another concept, though, of that, and one that really rings true in the idea of race amity, is that ultimately the power to transform the world is affected by love. And so it was so lovely to hear from the idea that each individual actually has a right and a responsibility to contribute to this. But we often get into a kind of a dichotomous roundabout as to whether the individual has full responsibility, or do we first need to transform all the systems, and then we'll get to that point. And I was just thinking, some of you may be familiar with the work, a podcast that comes on called The Happiness Lab, and Dr. Lori Santos is actually the host of that. And she, in one of the recent New York Times articles, said something that I thought maybe resonated a bit with what Dr. Henderson was speaking to, and that is that we don't need to do battle as to whether the individual must improve in order for the systems in society. And one of the things that she said in that interview is that we know individual action makes us more productive. It gives us emotional bandwidth, and that can mean the resilience we need to fight for stuff. I think people mistakenly think that these individual strategies sometimes build up the resilience you need to just exist in a bad society. But I think the real goal of them is to give you the resilience to, fight against having a bad society. So very simply, we're going to think about how all of the individual actions can, of course, collectively lead us to a much brighter future. So once again, thank you so very much, Dr. Henderson, for doing this. We also have a wonderful opportunity to welcome some of our leaders in our society, and who are ardent supporters of this. And I'm going to welcome the COO of the National Center for Race Amity, Mr. Glenn Fulmer, up to make those presentations.
I'm Glenn Fulmer, Chief Operating Officer of the National Center for Race Amity and the Director of the Race Amity Institute. A few months ago, a member of the Georgia House of Representatives stopped by, and we had a conversation. I think it was MLK Day, maybe a year ago. And then a few weeks later, she reached out and said the Georgia Legislative Black Caucus was looking for a space to host a Heritage Weekend. This was this past February. And they had done all sorts of things during that weekend. They had been meeting with the community and getting out into the neighborhood, and they wanted a space to just come and wrap up that weekend. And we thought, okay, well, the Race Amity Institute would be a great space to host that. And it was a beautiful gathering. We had 30 or 40 members of the GLBC that came and really had a relaxing, wonderful lunch and an opportunity to mingle and chat. And during that conversation, during that afternoon, I remember Marjan stood up and said, there's one thing that you guys can do for us, and that is to help us honor Race Amity Day. It's celebrated nationwide on the second Sunday in June. We're trying to really create a spirit of Race Amity in the city of Atlanta, raise awareness of what Race Amity Day is. And almost immediately, the hand raised, I think it was Doreen, said, consider it done. So the response was immediate, the support was immediate, and we have this wonderful resolution that was passed by the Georgia House of Representatives. I should be holding this like this, it looks like. So I'd like to invite up our friends from the Georgia Legislative Black Caucus. I believe Representative Park Canada is here, Representative Doreen Carter, and any others who would like to.
No, it's okay.
Wednesday. Come on up, Monica.
Yeah, turn that.
Monica's gonna.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
Well, I think we'd like to read the resolution, and then I'd like to offer the mic to Bart. So who would like to read
And
it?
take another picture.
With Monica.
Okay. A resolution recognizing June 14, 2026 as Race Amity Day. Whereas Race Amity Day is observed annually on the second Sunday in June, which occurs on June 14, 2026, and serves as a time to promote racial harmony, mutual respect, and genuine friendship among all people. And whereas the concept of amity, meaning friendship and goodwill, calls our communities to move beyond mere tolerance and toward meaningful relationships that foster unity, cooperation, and shared purpose. And whereas Race Amity Days has its historical roots in early 20th century Race Amity conventions and has been advanced in modern times by efforts such as those of the Baha'i National Spiritual Assembly to address racism and promote the oneness of humanity. And whereas the observance of this day encourages individuals, organizations, and communities to engage in activities that celebrate diversity through music, art, dialogue, education, and service, strengthening the social fabric of our state and nation. And whereas the state of Georgia is home to a rich and diverse population whose cultures, histories, and contributions have shaped the strength and resilience of our communities. And whereas fostering racial harmony and understanding is essential to achieving social justice, economic opportunity, and a unified future for all Georgians. And whereas in times of division and uncertainty, Race Amity Day serves as a powerful reminder that unity, compassion, and friendship across racial and cultural lines are foundational to a thriving and inclusive society. Now, therefore, be it resolved by the House of Representatives that the members of this body recognize June 14, 2026 as Race Amity Day. Be it further resolved that the Clerk of the House is authorized and directed to make appropriate copies of this resolution available for distribution to the public and press. I'd like to invite Representative Cannon to share a few words.
Thank you. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you all for having us here again. It has been a really enjoyable time to be in this space. This resolution, sponsored by Representative Carter, thank you for those beautiful words. Working together collaboratively was great. Thank you, Representative Mitchell, for signing on to this, and to our senator who always supports us on the other side. Thank you. You know, as we move towards what is quite shocking for us as legislative members, we are asking for the public to participate. That is that on this coming Wednesday, we have been called by the governor back to the Georgia State Capitol. We typically are out until January, but this is a special session, and the focus of this special session is race. How is it race? Is that us just saying it's race? No, it really is race. It is about redistricting. It is about reapportionment. And typically, reapportionment is done along different parameters around partisanship every time that we do the census, every 10 years. So we can regularly expect as a General Assembly that we will do redistricting. What's happened is a Supreme Court case based out of Louisiana. The decision came out in Calais, and what it says is that now legislatures can go back and they can draw districts without regard to race. And so what that means is that some states, shocker, southern states, have been doing this for the past month and a half, and we will be next. That starts this coming week. As the Black Caucus, and thank you, Monica, our Executive Director, for being here, we are saying black the cap. And what that means is it's a call to action for members of the Black and Brown community to come and to be present, but it is incomplete of course, without the understanding that we need other individuals to be in this conversation as well. And so you are invited to join us at the Capitol, which is just a few blocks from here, from the 17th to the 26th. We believe we will be off on Juneteenth. How shocking would it be if we were drawing racial lines on Juneteenth, which is supposed to be a state holiday. And until then, and if you want to know more, we are hosting an event tonight at the 12 Hotel here downtown. It's really close by. And I'll be here if you would like the information, but it's from 5 to 7 p.m. And you can talk with more Black Caucus members about that. Before I close, I want to see if our Vice Chair of the Caucus or any other members want to say anything. Thank you.
Well, first, we do want to say thank you. I'm Doreen Carter. I represent Georgia House District 93, and I'm the Vice Chair of the Georgia Legislative Black Caucus. And yes, being here earlier in the year was very rewarding in understanding the work that's being done. We had no idea at the time that we would be in the moment that we are now. So we know that God knew. So in the midst of a very racially charged moment, we are here on Race Amity Day. And thank you all for allowing us to be a part of this moment. And we know that our friendship has grown because we're here and you're here. And we just ask you to join in with us as we fight for what's right in the state of Georgia.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And I'll ask you to come back up. I also want to mention that we reached out to the Atlanta City Council. Our councilwoman that represents this area is Liliana Bakhtiari, and she was very, very sorry that she was not able to come. She had some unavoidable commitment. But she championed a proclamation for Race Amity Day in the City Council. It's also a lovely proclamation. We're going to set it up here so you can take a look at it. And hopefully, this will get bigger and better each year, and we'll have members of the City Council and others joining us next year. But it was very significant how immediate the response was and how enthusiastic they were to help us raise awareness of Race Amity Day.
So as we close out this formal part of the program, I'll reiterate again that I hope you won't just fly out of this space so quickly, because the opportunity for true friendship, as Dr. Henderson mentioned, is often breaking bread together, having a chance to look each other in the eye and to speak about things that are happening around us and how we can work collaboratively. I also want to make sure that you know that this is not the last opportunity for you to join us here. Beg your pardon. We actually will be commemorating Juneteenth, coming up June 19th, with a special event that will be a Writers for Race Amity Roundtable. Now, the Writers for Race Amity are a group of young people, teenagers in fact, who learned something about the history of the civil rights movement and set about making a multi-racial coalition that is riding bicycles from Washington, D.C. to Jackson, Mississippi, treading in the path of the freedom riders that came before them. They will be stopping here in Atlanta, and on Juneteenth, June 19th, from 7 to 9 p.m., you are invited to join us here in this center for their roundtable. I look forward to hearing what they have to say, and I hope you'll join them as well.
And in conclusion, I would like for you to invite all of you to explore this venue. Upstairs, we have one contemporary gallery, and there's a new exhibit. And Farron is the curator of the gallery and the owner of One Contemporary. Thank you for all the help you always give us when we have events. So please feel free to explore the gallery, the wonderful exhibit that's down here. Farron can explain to you more. And then, of course, Race Amity. We have beautiful gardens outside. So feel free to explore the entire venue. Thank you so much for attending. And we hope we partner together. And refreshments, yes. Thank you. Have a great afternoon.
It was. You can find it on YouTube. And I think, do you have the channel? Do you know where to find it? Do you want to give her the channel? Now I know you're how old you
Great job, man. That was awesome. Spot on and really worked out well. What's this thing gonna be like? Live streamed or something? Oh, so it's gonna be after.
It's already been.
So this lady was saying that